My rich uncle found out I lived in my car while working 2 jobs for college and I was 21 when my entire world shattered. My father, my rock, my protector, lost his battle with pancreatic cancer. It was brutal, fast, and left me and my mom, Kimberly, in pieces. Or at least, that's what I thought. For the first few months after his passing, it felt like we were in this together. 2 people struggling to stay afloat in an ocean of grief. We held each other up, or so I believe. But little by little, I noticed my mother was changing. She wasn't crying as much, wasn't reminiscing about Dad the way I did. Instead, she started spending more time outside the house, getting her hair done, going out for meetings she never explained, and coming home smelling of expensive perfume that definitely wasn't hers. 14 months after my dad's death, she introduced me to Ronald. Ronald was everything my father wasn't: flashy, loud, a man who commanded attention the moment he walked into a room. A real estate developer with a net worth that could probably buy our entire town twice over. I remember the first time I met him at a restaurant my mom had chosen, one that served plates so tiny they should have come with a magnifying glass. He extended a perfectly manicured hand to me and gave me a smile that was more condescending than kind. "So, this is Emily," he said, his tone dripping with something I couldn't place but immediately disliked. "I've heard so much about you." I sat there, gripping my fork so tightly my knuckles turned white, listening as my mother gushed about how wonderful he was, how he had helped her see the light again. Meanwhile, all I could think about was how my father had only been gone a little over a year, and here she was, acting like he was some distant memory rather than the man who raised me. 9 months later, she married him. I wasn't surprised. I was barely consulted. It was like my opinions, my grief, my existence barely mattered. My mother was stepping into a new life, one filled with wealth, private clubs, high society galas, and vacations in places I couldn't even pronounce. And the thing was, I wasn't included in any of it. It became clear that I was a problem she needed to solve. The moment I truly understood that was the day she sat me down in our kitchen. The same kitchen where Dad used to cook us breakfast every Saturday morning. She placed a cup of coffee in front of me like she was about to have some heartfelt conversation, but the way she held herself, the way she couldn't quite meet my eyes, I knew something was off. "Emily," she said with that fake softness she used when she was about to say something awful, "I've been thinking about what's best for both of us. And, well, Ronald and I believe it's time for you to spread your wings." I set my cup down. "Spread my wings?" I repeated, my voice flat. She forced a smile. "Yes. You're young, and you need your own experiences. New York is such a wonderful place for that." That's when it hit me. "You're sending me away," I said, barely above a whisper. My mother sighed like I was being dramatic. "I'm not sending you away, sweetheart. I'm giving you an opportunity. Jennifer has agreed to let you stay with her for a while, and you know how much she loves New York. It'll be fun. A fresh start. Fresh start. More like an exile." I should have fought harder. I should have screamed, demanded to stay in the house I grew up in, the house my father built with his own hands. But what was the point? My mother had already replaced my father with Ronald, and now she was replacing me with whatever this new life of hers was. A week later, I was standing outside my childhood home, my bags packed, my Uber waiting to take me to the airport. My mother hugged me briefly, like she was checking a box. Ronald didn't even bother coming outside. "Be good for Jennifer," my mother said. "And don't call too much, okay? Just enjoy yourself." She didn't say, "I love you." I boarded that plane, numb. I looked out the window as we took off, watching my hometown shrink beneath me, and I realized that my mother had done what she had been trying to do all along: erase any trace of my father, including me. When I landed in New York, I had this stupid, tiny hope that maybe things wouldn't be so bad. Maybe Aunt Jennifer would be different. Maybe she would actually want me there, unlike my mother. That hope lasted all of 10 minutes. The moment I stepped into her house, dragging my 2 overstuffed suitcases behind me, Jennifer barely looked up from her laptop. "You can take the guest room for now," she said, typing away like she had a deadline to meet. "But we need to talk about rent. I'll give you the first month to settle in, but after that, you'll need to contribute." I stood there, exhausted from the flight, trying to process what she had just said. "Rent?" I echoed, blinking at her. Jennifer finally looked up, her expression flat. "Yes, rent. You're an adult, Emily. Life isn't free. I can't just let you stay here without pulling your weight." I wanted to remind her that I was in college, that my mother had sent me here without a backup plan, that I didn't have a job lined up yet, but I could already see there was no point. Jennifer wasn't offering me a home. She was offering me a temporary place to exist as long as I could afford to. Her kids, Jason and Melanie, weren't any better. From the second I arrived, it was clear that I was an inconvenience in their perfect little world. Jason, 20 years old and living like a king in his mother's house, barely acknowledged me unless it was to make some snide remark about how New York isn't for small-town kids. Melanie, at 22, was even worse. She would glance at my clothes, my shoes, the cheap suitcase I dragged in, and roll her eyes like I had personally offended her with my existence. It didn't take long for me to realize that to them, I was nothing more than the poor, unwanted relative who had invaded their space. They never said it outright, but they didn't have to. Every dismissive comment, every look of annoyance when I walked into the room, every time they made plans without even pretending to invite me, it all told me exactly where I stood. And then there was the rent. The first month flew by in a blur of job applications, rejection emails, and eating whatever leftovers Jennifer allowed me to touch. When the second month rolled around, she handed me an envelope with a handwritten note inside. Rent due, $600. Utilities not included. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. Jennifer, I don't have that kind of money yet, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She sighed like she had expected this. You need to figure it out, Emily. I can't cover for you. That night, I scrolled through every job listing I could find, applying for anything and everything that didn't require a degree. Fast food, retail, customer service, if it paid, I applied. But New York wasn't exactly welcoming to a broke college student with no local connections. In the end, I got desperate. The first job I landed was at a gas station, working the afternoon shift from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. It wasn't great, but it was something. The pay was barely above minimum wage, and the customers ranged from mildly annoying to downright terrifying. Drunk guys trying to flirt, impatient businessmen acting like their time was more valuable than mine, teenagers stealing snacks and running out the door. It was chaos. But I sucked it up because I had no choice. Then I got the second job. A laundromat on the other side of town needed a night shift worker, someone to keep the place running from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The pay was slightly better, but the hours were brutal. By the time my shift ended, I was running on fumes. I would take the subway back to Jennifer's, shower as quickly as I could, and try to squeeze in a nap before heading to my afternoon shift at the gas station. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. I stopped going to college. I told myself it was temporary, that I just needed a semester off to save money, but deep down, I knew the truth. There was no way I could keep up with school while working 16 hours a day just to survive. At first, Jennifer pretended to be supportive. "You're finally learning responsibility," she said one morning as I forced myself to eat a stale bagel before heading to work. But Melanie and Jason? They didn't even hide their amusement. "Can't wait to tell my friends I have a cousin who works in a laundromat," Melanie had laughed one night. "That's so tragic." Jason, stretching out on the couch with a smug grin, added, "Hey, at least you'll always smell like clean clothes, right?" I hated them. I hated all of it. But I kept my mouth shut and worked. Then came the breaking point. One night, after another exhausting shift, I dragged myself into Jennifer's house only to find Melanie and her friends sprawled across the living room. Empty takeout boxes, half-empty bottles of expensive wine, and discarded shoes littered the floor. "Hey, Cinderella," Melanie called out when she saw me. "Mind grabbing us another bottle from the kitchen?" I didn't answer. I just walked past them, heading straight to my room. But when I pushed the door open, I stopped dead in my tracks. My bed was gone. Not just the sheets or the pillows, the entire mattress was missing. I spun around, my exhaustion quickly turning into panic. "Where's my bed?" Melanie smirked, barely looking up from her phone. "Oh, Mom needed it for a guest." A guest? Jennifer had given away my bed for someone else, without even bothering to tell me. I didn't say a word. I just turned around, walked back outside, and got in my car. That night, I slept in the back seat. At first, I told myself it was temporary, just for a night, just until I figured out what to do. But then another night passed. And another. I kept going to work like nothing had changed, showering in the gas station bathroom during my shift, eating whatever I could afford. The rent I had been struggling to pay? I stopped handing it over. Not that Jennifer seemed to care. She was too busy entertaining guests and keeping up appearances. Weeks passed. Nobody noticed, or if they did, they didn't care. I was officially invisible. The only time Jennifer acknowledged me was when she called, annoyed, to ask, "Are you coming back to get your things, or should I just throw them out?" I wanted to scream at her, to ask how she could be so heartless, but I didn't have the energy. Instead, I just said, "Do whatever you want," and hung up. I had nothing left there. Nothing at all. And just like that, I was homeless. I thought I had hit rock bottom when I started sleeping in my car. I thought that was the worst it could get. But I was wrong. Because when you have people like Jason and Melanie in your life, there's always another level of hell waiting for you. At first, they didn't even notice I was gone. Or maybe they did, and they just didn't care. But at some point, they realized I wasn't in the house anymore, and instead of asking where I was or why I wasn't coming back, they turned my situation into a joke. It started with small things: snide comments when I came into the house to grab something I had left behind, exaggerated fake sympathy about how hard life on the streets must be. But then, Jason and Melanie got an idea. And that idea turned into a TikTok account. They called it, My Homeless Cousin. The first video was simple. A shaky, zoomed-in clip of me sleeping in my car, curled up in the back seat with my hoodie pulled over my face. Jason's voice narrated, fake tears in his tone. This is my poor, homeless cousin, Emily. Pray for her, guys. She has nothing. Well, except this sick parking spot outside a laundromat. Laughter in the background. End video. I didn't even know about it until a coworker at the gas station showed me. Yo, is this you? He asked, shoving his phone in my face. I watched in horror as the video played, my own exhausted, sleeping form turned into a joke for thousands of strangers. The comments were a mix of fake sympathy and outright cruelty. LMAO, imagine being this down bad. Why doesn't she just get a real job? Nah, this has to be staged. Nobody actually lives like this. Bro, let her sleep, damn. She should start an OnlyFans. Desperate times call for desperate measures. My hands shook as I scrolled through them, my stomach twisting into knots. There were hundreds of comments, then thousands. The video had gone viral. Jason and Melanie had turned my suffering into their personal entertainment. And the worst part? They didn't stop. Every few days, a new video would pop up. Clips of me eating a gas station sandwich in my car. Footage of me walking to my shift, looking half dead from exhaustion. Jason throwing a dollar bill at my feet and laughing while Melanie filmed. Their audience ate it up. OMG, throw her some coins next time. Get her a cardboard sign so she can complete the look. Do a 24-hour challenge living in her car. The more viral their posts got, the bolder they became. And soon, their followers weren't just laughing from behind their screens. They started showing up. It started small. A couple of kids driving past the laundromat, yelling out the window, Yo, where's the homeless cousin? A few people knocking on my car window, trying to get a reaction. Then one night, after my shift, I walked outside to find my car covered in garbage. Empty fast food bags, half-eaten sandwiches, crumpled receipt. A drink cup with soda still in it, leaking onto my windshield. I stood there, staring at it, my body frozen. Laughter echoed from across the street. A group of teenagers stood there, one of them holding his phone up, recording me. Come on, do something funny, one of them called out. Give us a reaction. I didn't. I refused. I grabbed a handful of garbage and threw it to the ground, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. But that was exactly what they wanted. Within hours, there was a new video on TikTok. LMAO, we found her IRL and she got mad. Chill, queen. The comments flooded in. She should be grateful. Free food. Yo, someone needs to drop a whole pizza on her car. Next time, bring a blanket. The poor thing is probably cold. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to disappear. Jason and Melanie had taken everything from me. My dignity, my privacy, my last shred of control over my own life. And the worst part? There was nothing I could do to stop it. By the time winter hit, I had stopped feeling anything at all. The cold, the exhaustion, the constant humiliation, it all blended together into a numbness I couldn't shake. I went through the motions, dragging myself from one shift to another, barely surviving on gas station coffee and whatever cheap food I could afford. The nights were the worst. I had never known cold like that before. New York in the dead of winter was unforgiving, and my car, my so-called home, was barely enough to keep me from freezing. Some nights, I would wake up with my fingers so stiff I could barely move them, my breath visible in the air even inside the car. Then came the coldest night of the season. The temperature had dropped to 20 below zero, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and refused to leave. I had wrapped myself in every piece of clothing I owned, curled up in the back seat, but it wasn't enough. I could feel it creeping in, my body shivering so violently that my teeth chattered. My hands were numb, my feet were worse, and for the first time, a terrifying thought crossed my mind. What if I don't wake up? I don't know how long I lay there, drifting between exhaustion and panic, when suddenly, the driver's side door yanked open. I jolted upright, my heart slamming into my ribs. A tall figure stood there, silhouetted against the dim streetlights. I barely had time to react before he spoke. I think we need to talk. It was Uncle Robert. I had barely spoken to him since moving in with Jennifer. He was always working, always away, never involved in the chaos of that house. He was quiet, reserved, the complete opposite of his wife. And now, here he was, standing in the freezing cold, looking down at me like he had been expecting this moment all along. I was too stunned to speak. My lips were too cold to form words anyway. Robert sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Come on, kid. You can't stay out here. He didn't wait for me to respond. He just stepped back, giving me space to climb out of the car. My legs were so stiff I nearly collapsed, but he caught me, steadying me with a firm grip. Without another word, he led me inside the laundromat. The warmth hit me like a slap. My body ached from the sudden change in temperature, but I didn't care. I stood there, shivering, trying to process what was happening. Robert grabbed a chair and sat across from me. He studied me for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, he sighed. You know, I've been watching you for a while, he said, nodding toward the ceiling. Cameras in this place. I own the building. I blinked, my frozen brain struggling to catch up. I've seen you working. I've seen you sleeping in that car. And I've seen what my kids have been doing. His jaw tightened slightly. I should have stepped in sooner. That's on me. I swallowed hard, feeling the burn of shame creeping up my throat. I didn't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I tried, but... Robert held up a hand, stopping me. You don't have to explain, he said. I know. Silence stretched between us. Then, he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. There's something you don't know about your dad, he said. I looked up, startled. Robert exhaled slowly, his gaze distant. Before he met your mom, before he got his life together, he and I were in the same situation you're in now. Homeless. Sleeping in a car. Working dead-end jobs, just trying to get by. My breath hitched. I had never heard this before. My dad, the man I had always seen as strong, steady, the one who had built our life from the ground up, had been where I was now? I was a screw-up, Robert continued. Your dad, he was the one who kept me going. He never gave up, even when it felt impossible. And when he finally made it, when he got out of that life, he never forgot where he came from. He met my eyes then. Neither have I. I didn't know what to say. Robert leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I'm giving you an apartment, he said. Upstairs. It's not much, but it's warm and it's yours. No rent. I stared at him, my mind refusing to process the words. What? He nodded. But there's a catch. Of course there was. There always was. I braced myself for whatever was coming. You work here, he said simply. Full-time. You run the laundromat, manage the night shift. And you go back to school. I opened my mouth to protest, to tell him I couldn't, that I had no money, that I had already failed. But he cut me off before I could speak. I'll cover your tuition, he said. But you pull your weight. No slacking. No excuses. I stared at him, my heart pounding. This couldn't be real. It had to be some cruel joke. People didn't just do things like this. Why? I asked, my voice cracking. Why are you helping me? Robert's expression softened, just slightly. Because someone once did the same for me, he said. And because your dad would never forgive me if I let his daughter freeze to death in a car. Tears burned in my eyes. I clenched my fists, trying to hold them back. Do we have a deal? Robert asked. I exhaled shakily and nodded. That night, for the first time in months, I slept in a real bed. A small, worn-out mattress in a tiny apartment above a laundromat. But to me, it felt like a palace. And for the first time in a long time, I had hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, I had something resembling stability. My tiny apartment above the laundromat wasn't much, but it was mine. I had a job, a warm place to sleep, and the promise of a future I never thought I'd have again. But peace doesn't last long when you're surrounded by people like my Aunt Jennifer. It all started when she found out about Robert's offer. I had been living in the apartment for about a month, balancing work at the laundromat and slowly easing back into my college classes when she stormed in one evening like a hurricane in designer heels. The door slammed against the wall so hard I thought the glass might shatter. Jennifer's face was twisted in fury, her usual composed, polished demeanor completely gone. You little snake, she hissed, her voice shaking. I can't believe this. I barely had time to react before she launched into a full-blown tirade. I take you into my home, and this is how you repay me? Seducing my husband. The accusation hit me like a punch to the stomach. I blinked at her, completely stunned. What? Don't play dumb, she spat, stepping closer. I know exactly what you're doing. You've been manipulating Robert, playing the poor, helpless orphan, and now you're living in an apartment he gave you. How long until you get your hands on his money too? I laughed. I couldn't help it. The absurdity of it all was too much. Jennifer, are you insane? I said, shaking my head. Your husband saw that I was literally freezing to death in my car and decided to help me. That's it. There's nothing else going on. She wasn't listening. She was pacing now, her fury bubbling over. Do you know what this looks like? Do you have any idea what people will say? I folded my arms, exhaustion creeping in. I don't care what people say. Robert is the only person in this family who's actually treated me like a human being. That only seemed to fuel her rage. She turned on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door so hard behind her that the walls shook. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Jennifer didn't just leave it at an angry confrontation. She turned it into a full-blown scandal. Within days, I started hearing whispers. People side-eyeing me when I walked into work, laundromat customers making snide comments under their breath. I heard she's sleeping with the owner. Poor Jennifer. Imagine your own niece stealing your husband. She moved in pretty fast, didn't she? It was humiliating. But then, something happened that turned the entire situation on its head. Jason. Yes, that Jason, the same cousin who had spent months mocking me, filming me for TikTok, and treating me like trash, was the one who accidentally blew up his own mother's life. One night, after what I assumed was another one of Jennifer's dramatic outbursts, Jason walked into the laundromat looking like he had just seen a ghost. He sat down in one of the plastic chairs and just stared at me. I ignored him at first. I didn't have time for whatever nonsense he was about to throw my way. But then he said something that made my stomach drop. My mom's been stealing from me. I turned to look at him, confused. What are you talking about? He swallowed hard, running a hand through his hair. I was using my iPad last night and I saw some messages. From Ronald. I froze. Ronald. As in Ronald, my mother's husband. The same man Jennifer had supposedly never met before my mother married him. What messages? I asked, my voice suddenly hoarse. Jason let out a bitter laugh. Let's just say my mom and your mom's husband are a lot closer than anyone thought. The room felt like it was spinning. Jason went on, his voice filled with disbelief. They've been together for years. Apparently, before he even married your mom, he and my mom had this whole plan. He was going to marry Kimberly, and once they were legally tied together, they were going to siphon money from Robert's business. Some kind of long con. They were planning to steal almost $10 million. I couldn't breathe. It all made sense. Jennifer's sudden hostility, her obsession with controlling Robert, the way my mother had so easily pushed me out of her life the moment she secured her new, wealthier husband. And then Jason said something that changed everything. My mom has been stealing from my educational fund too. I stared at him. What? He nodded grimly. The account was supposed to have over $100,000 in it. Turns out there's barely anything left. She's been taking money out for years. For the first time in my life, Jason actually looked devastated. She's been lying to all of us, he said, shaking his head. And I was too busy being an asshole to see it. I didn't know what to say. Neither of us did. We sat there in silence, the weight of it all crashing down around us. And then, just as I was starting to process what this all meant, Jason looked at me, his expression unreadable. We have to tell Robert. And just like that, everything changed. By the time Jason and I told Robert everything, I expected some kind of explosion. A confrontation. Maybe even a physical fight. But Robert didn't yell, didn't storm out, didn't demand answers right away. Instead, he sat back in his chair, folded his hands together, and simply said, I see. That was it. No outrage, no anger, just a calm, knowing expression that sent a shiver down my spine. For the next few weeks, I barely saw him. He wasn't at the laundromat, he wasn't at home, and he certainly wasn't around Jennifer. But something was happening behind the scenes. I could feel it. Then Jason's 23rd birthday rolled around, and that's when everything finally came to a head. Jennifer had planned an over-the-top party for him, one of those extravagant, completely unnecessary events that screamed, look how much money I have. She rented out a luxury event space, invited dozens of people, and made sure there was a professional photographer documenting every second of it. Jason played along, acting like the obedient son she still believed him to be. But what she didn't know was that the real guest of honor that night wasn't her beloved child. It was Justice, because Robert had planned his own surprise. The party started like any other. Drinks flowed, people laughed, and Jennifer basked in the attention like a queen holding court. I stood in the corner, watching, my heart pounding as I waited for what I knew was coming. Jason was next to me, gripping his glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. Then Robert arrived. He walked in like he owned the place, wearing a suit that somehow made him look even more intimidating than usual. But he wasn't alone. Behind him came 3 lawyers, their expressions unreadable. Then 2 men I didn't recognize, official-looking, dressed in suits that screamed federal agents. And then, trailing behind them, 2 uniformed FBI officers. The room went silent. Jennifer's smile froze on her face. "Robert," she said, her voice overly sweet, trying to mask the sudden tension. "You didn't tell me you were bringing guests." Robert smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that put people at ease. It was the kind that made your stomach drop. "Oh, I didn't want to ruin the surprise," he said, stepping forward. "This is a birthday party, after all." Jennifer's eyes flickered to the men behind him, realization slowly sinking in. "What's going on?" Robert didn't answer her. Instead, he turned to one of the lawyers, who stepped forward and set down a thick stack of documents on a nearby table. "Let's go over some things, shall we?" the lawyer said, flipping open a file. What followed was nothing short of a complete dismantling of Jennifer's life. The lawyer began reading through evidence. Bank statements showing unauthorized transfers from Robert's company, fake businesses created under Jennifer's name, offshore accounts filled with stolen money. Every single shady move she and Ronald had made was laid out in painful, undeniable detail. But the worst part? The emails. Jason had found them by accident on his iPad, but Robert's legal team had gone further, digging through years of correspondence between Jennifer and Ronald. And they weren't just about money. They were full of arrogance, mockery. They made fun of Robert, laughing about how easy it was to manipulate him, about how stupid he was to trust Jennifer. The room was dead silent as those messages were read aloud. And then came the final blow. Robert pulled out his phone, pressed a button, and suddenly, Ronald's voice filled the room. A recorded conversation. One where he and Jennifer were openly discussing their plan, laughing about how they were going to bleed Robert dry and disappear. I turned to look at my mother. Kimberly's face had gone completely pale. She sat frozen, staring at the phone as if she could somehow will it to stop playing. Ronald's voice was still going. "She's a damn idiot," he said, laughing. "She thinks she's so smart, but she's just as clueless as Robert. By the time they figure it out, we'll be long gone." That was when Jennifer lost it. She shot up from her chair, her face twisted with fury. "That's enough. You're twisting things, Robert. This isn't." Before she could finish, one of the agents stepped forward, holding up a badge. "Jennifer Reynolds," he said, his voice steady, "you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes." The gasp that echoed through the room was almost deafening. Jennifer barely had time to react before the FBI officers moved in, pulling her hands behind her back. She struggled, screaming, but there was nothing she could do. And then, as if on cue, Ronald walked in. He had arrived late to the party, likely expecting a night of celebration and luxury. Instead, he walked straight into his own arrest. The moment he saw the FBI agents, his face drained of color. He turned, trying to bolt, but 2 officers were already moving toward him. "Ronald Carter, you are under arrest," one of them said, grabbing his arm. The whole room watched in stunned silence as they both were handcuffed, their protests falling on deaf ears. Kimberly sat there, still frozen, her lips parted in shock. For once in her life, she had nothing to say. The entire party had gone from a glamorous celebration to something out of a crime drama. And as I stood there, watching the people who had ruined my life finally get what they deserved, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. Robert turned to me then, his expression unreadable. "Let's go," he said quietly. And just like that, we walked out, leaving behind the chaos, the scandals, and the people who had tried to destroy us. Justice had finally been served. Jennifer and Ronald are in prison. It still feels surreal to say it, but it's the truth. The trial didn't take long. With all the evidence Robert's lawyers had collected, there was no way out for them. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, every single charge stuck. They both received hefty prison sentences, and whatever money they thought they had carefully hidden was seized by the authorities. Kimberly, my mother, lost everything. It turned out that while she was so busy scheming with Ronald, he was running his own con on her. He had been siphoning money from her personal accounts the entire time, stashing it away in places she couldn't reach. By the time the truth came out, she had nothing left. The luxurious life she had built with him vanished overnight. No private clubs, no high-end shopping sprees, no expensive dinners. Just debt, shame, and a bitter realization that she had been used just as much as she had tried to use others. She tried to reach out to me once. A single, hesitant phone call. I let it go to voicemail. Jason and Melanie lost their cushy lifestyle too. No more unlimited credit cards, no more luxury cars, no more coasting through life while someone else footed the bill. For the first time in their lives, they had to figure out what it meant to actually work. And they did. At first, Jason was resentful, full of anger at his mother, at Ronald, at the world. But as reality settled in, something in him shifted. He wasn't the same smug, entitled person he had been before. Melanie struggled too, but without her mother's influence, she started seeing life a little differently. They had to survive, and the only person willing to give them a shot was Robert. He hired them at the laundromat, just like he had done for me. No special treatment, no cushy positions. They started at the bottom, scrubbing machines, dealing with difficult customers, learning what real work felt like. I won't pretend it was easy. The first few weeks were full of mistakes and complaints, but Robert had a way of keeping them in line. He wasn't just their uncle anymore, he was their mentor. And, surprisingly, they listened. Over time, they didn't just work at the laundromat. They started learning the business. Robert, with his years of experience, took them under his wing, teaching them everything he knew. How to manage employees, handle finances, expand operations. Jason, to my surprise, actually had a good head for numbers when he put in the effort. Melanie, despite her initial resistance, turned out to have a sharp sense for customer service. And somehow, against all odds, we became something that almost felt like a family. It was awkward at first. I didn't trust them, not after everything they had done. But Jason apologized one night, really apologized, without excuses or justifications. He admitted how cruel he had been, how blind he had been to his own privilege, and for the first time, I believed he actually meant it. Melanie followed not long after. It wasn't an instant fix, but it was a start. We worked side by side, day after day, rebuilding not just the business but ourselves. And me? For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. I had a home. A real one. Not a car, not a temporary bed in someone else's house, but a place that was truly mine. The apartment above the laundromat wasn't fancy, but it was warm, safe, and filled with the quiet peace I had been missing for so long. I went back to school, just like Robert had asked me to. It wasn't easy juggling work and classes, but I was determined. I wasn't going to let anyone take my future from me again. Robert became more than just an uncle. He became a father figure, a mentor, the person who had saved me when no one else had cared. And somehow, in the strangest twist of all, Jason and Melanie became my friends. We ran the business together now. The laundromat was just the beginning. Robert had bigger plans, and he made sure we were part of them. I had spent so much time believing I was alone, that I had no one. But in the end, I found something I never expected. Not just a second chance. A family. And for the first time in a long, long time, a future worth looking forward to.